get started. My name's Charlie Cote, and I'm one of the founding members of ROC-ACT. I'm not sure really what that means, but we'll find out as we go. This is our first official meeting, and we're in the process of becoming an affiliate of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science group, ACT, which developed ACT. And we want you to stay tuned for more news, because there's other great things that we're planning on doing, including upcoming talks by Ron, which we're excited about, and then possibly even Stephen Hayes, which we're really excited about. Not that we're not
don't worry.
more excited about that, but that's pretty exciting when you get the founder of something who's willing to show up and talk about it. And then there'll be opportunities for book club and consultation group, which we already have a consultation group that's going now that meets every month. And so we hope that you'll enjoy this presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Jeanette Funk, who's going to introduce our speaker. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you. So Dr. Raghi earned his PhD in clinical psychology at UCLA. He was an active duty therapist in the US Navy for 4 years, including 2 deployments to Iraq. So we'd like to thank him for his service, of course. He's been a professor of psychology at the University of Rochester since 2004. He was actually my lovely dissertation advisor there. Although his research has largely focused on strengthening romantic relationships and families, much more of his recent work has focused on understanding the roles of psychological flexibility and mindfulness in the everyday lives of individuals and couples and families. Consistent with his increasing focus on ACT processes, he currently serves as an associate editor of the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. He's a very busy lab, and he has a lot more research than he can show us today. I know that for sure in this introduction. So stay tuned, like Charlie said, in the coming months. So hopefully we'll be having some more kind of lunch and learn events over the summer. Ron also was on the founding team of Agape Wellness, Inc., a tech startup company that has developed Agape, a smartphone app that strengthens relationships by building moments of connection for couples with just a few minutes a day. A very cool app, so you check that out. And you can also check out his YouTube channel, where he will have the recording of this talk tonight. And he also has recordings of his previous talks, some loving kindness meditations. And there's actually a very cool cocktail one that I did last night as a cocktail meditation. Amazing. So it made me very thirsty. So we're so excited to welcome Dr. Raghi for his first ROC-ACT presentation. And we are excited to show or to see the research that he has to show us this evening. So thank you. Ron.
Thank you, Jeanette. Jeanette was actually my very first graduate student. So I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. I think one of the drafts of her dissertation had like 120 tables in it. And Louisa Bonetto has still not forgiven me for that. Here, I'm just trying to navigate. There we go. Patience. Oh, your picture shifted. So I'm thanking you, Jeanette, for inviting me. Okay, I think that will work. So I'm going to be talking to you about psychological flexibility and some data I have on how it works as a mechanism in ACT treatment. Jeanette told me that not everyone was, Jeanette told me that not everyone was as familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy. So I'm just going to do a tiny bit of background. It's a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. It's transdiagnostic, so it is effective at treating a range of disorders. It's based on relational frame theory and the idea that by changing the meaning of behavior and the meaning of experiences, you can radically alter how they impact your life. And within ACT, Therapists are encouraged to promote the use of 6 forms of psychological flexibility and to help reduce the use of 6 corresponding forms of psychological flexibility. There are over 600 published randomized controlled trials on ACT, and you can find them listed at contextualscience.org. Gloucester just, well, a couple of years ago, published a review of over 35 meta-analyses of ACT. 20 of them were looking at ACT versus control conditions. And it's clear that ACT is very effective and efficacious. It's efficacious across the range of presenting problems. And if you just do a quick Amazon search, you can see they have materials for trauma, depression, anxiety, working with children, working with parents, working with perfectionism. It's been used in the workplace quite a bit. They also have a very nice range of tools for clinicians who are interested in learning ACT. And since most of my talk is going to be focused on forms of psychological flexibility and inflexibility, I'm just going to run through them really quickly. So there are 6 forms of psychological inflexibility, and you can see there are lines running from each of them to all others. They are presumed to be very strongly interrelated with one another. So beginning with lack of present moment awareness, this is sort of living your life on autopilot, drifting mindlessly through your days, inattentive and distracted, not really noticing your thoughts, feelings, or experiences. Experiential avoidance is reacting to difficult experiences or thoughts by distracting yourself from them. And I think it could be pretty successfully argued that the US culture is one of maximum distraction. And I have to admit, I got up at 4:30 this morning to finish prepping this talk. So in the last half hour, I've spent a lot of it on TikTok just to wind down a bit. But if you use that avoidance to avoid your thoughts and feelings, it's not a very effective emotion regulation strategy. It tends to exacerbate their effects. Self as content is over-identifying with your own thoughts and feelings, seeing them, your thoughts and feelings and experiences defining you. And that can also easily lead to judging and shaming yourself. Cognitive fusion is getting stuck in your thoughts, fusing with them, having them run around your head like a broken record. And then lack of contact with values is living to work rather than working to live. Losing track of what's important and often shows up in the therapy room as people sort of in survival or crisis mode. If they stay in that mode for long stretches, when people stay in that mode for long stretches of time, it can not only impede them making positive changes in their life, but it can leave their lives feeling pretty. And then finally, inaction, letting those negative thoughts, feelings, experiences prevent you from taking steps towards your goals and not moving, feeling very stuck. So instead, ACT seeks to, through metaphors and exercises, seeks to promote corresponding dimensions of flexibility, present moment awareness, living fully in each moment, embracing the here and now. As somebody is trying to text me. And this is not, the present moment and awareness is not, it is one key aspect of what mindfulness researchers would call mindfulness. Acceptance, that's taking an open-hearted stance to all experiences, both the positive and the negative. Self as context is maintaining a deeper perspective, being able to hold a broader view, no matter how stressful or difficult life or experiences get. Could also describe it as sort of pulling out of the immediate drama. Something difficult happens, you're presented with a challenge, and instead of just immediately gut reacting to it, allowing yourself some space to decenter and potentially choose a different way of responding to that event or that thought or feeling. Hopefully one grounded a little more in self-compassion. Diffusion is gently experiencing thoughts and feelings, realizing that they are transitory, that they will pass naturally on their own, holding on to them lightly, still accepting them, but not clinging to them, viewing them as leaves on a stream and knowing that with time they will pass. Contact with values is really trying to hold your values in your mind throughout your daily life, allowing them to help shape your daily life. It is a key step toward having a value-driven life and really not losing sight of the bigger picture of what you really want out of life. And we all have busy days where even if we keep our values in mind, we may not be able to act on them all that much, but trying to hold them in the present moment and keep yourself aware. And then finally, committed action, which is the antithesis of inaction, taking daily steps toward your goals, toward your deeper values, staying the course on those difficult paths, even when it's hard, even through setbacks, and
Ron, you're muted.
please tell me
Not the whole time, you just cut out now.
okay.
Just before this slide.
Okay, sorry about that. So that's my summary, my brief overview of psychological flexibility in the context of ACT. And now I'm going to take you through results of about 3 studies that I've done, starting with one looking at measures of flexibility, then moving on onto the results looking at flexibility as a mechanism. So there are an ever-increasing number of self-report scales that you can use to assess psychological flexibility. I started with the AAQ2 because it was one of the first scales to be developed, and it's still one of the most widely used scales. It has the advantage of being very short, easy to incorporate in clinical or research settings. It's 10 items, although it's 7 negatively worded items and 3 positively worded items. And typically people just use the 7 negatively worded items. And it's a fairly good measure of global inflexibility. The OESQ is a 4-item scale, similar to the AAQ2. It's been developed within the last 5 or 8 years. It also measures global inflexibility. Those are the two single-dimensional scales that I wanted to mention. Then around 2016, 2 multidimensional scales were developed. The Compact by Francis et al. It's 23 items. It was developed in a 37-item pool that was given to 377 college students. And it assesses openness to experience, behavioral awareness, and valued action. And the MPFI that I developed with a student, JC Rolfs. In fact, it is JC Rolfs who got me interested in psychological flexibility and ACT. We spent about 3 years. We gave 554 items to over 3,000 people and ran all kinds of complicated analyses, because that's what I tend to do. and identified 60 items, making up 5 item subscales that assess each of the 12 dimensions of the HEXAFLEX model. You can have 12 subscale scores on the MPFI. That stands for multidimensional psychological flexibility. You can also make 2 composite scores. You can take the 6 flexibility subscales and create a global flexibility composite. And you can take the 6 inflexibility subscales, average them together, and create a global inflexibility. With another one of my students, Jennifer Dax, and a collaborator, Katie Saint, we did a study evaluating the 4 scales that I just showed you. We collected data from 2,800 online subjects, and with Katie's help, we actually collected qualitative. We did a case study and published this back in 2019. So we included those measures, and we included a measure of depressive symptoms, life satisfactions, and quality of life. Now, we ran regressions predicting each of these outcomes: depressive symptoms, life satisfaction, quality of life. And in the first step of the regression, we let the AAQ2 predict as much as it could in that outcome. And then we looked at what did all of these other scales predict above and beyond the AAQ2? How much extra information do we get shifting to these longer multidimensional scales? So you can see that with the OESQ, you don't get a whole lot of extra information. It's just a 4-item scale. It's very similar to the AAQ2. But with the compact, the 2 MPFI composites, and with all 12 MPFI subscales, we get a lot more information when we're predicting depressive symptoms. Well, not as much depressive symptoms, but relationship quality, work, learning, helping, creativity, understanding, and general life satisfaction. Then we did the reverse. Since the MPFI came out as sort of explaining the largest amount of variance in our outcomes, in our dimensions of well-being, we put the MPFI in, 12 subscales in, let them predict first, and then looked at how much the other scales could predict above and beyond that. When we did that, although there were small amounts of additional prediction, you can see there, by and large, once you had predicted with the MPFI these various outcomes, there wasn't a whole lot of variance to it. And I should say, I'm calling this prediction. This was just a cross-sectional study. We also ran some analyses that Jeanette is all too familiar with, despite her negative field that disrupts computers. These are item response theory analyses, and they look at the quality of information that different scales give, provided those scales are measuring the same thing. So we just looked at global inflexibility. And the 30-item MPFI gave a lot more information on global inflexibility than any of the shorter scales. When we actually, I showed you the amount of variance predicted for the various outcomes. When we actually look at those regressions a little more closely, you can see interesting patterns come out with certain dimensions of flexibility or inflexibility being more strongly linked to specific outcomes. You just wouldn't necessarily get that with scales that collapse flexibility down to a smaller number of dimensions. Now, I'll grant you, 60 items is a long scale. And not only is it a 60-item scale, but you have to create 12 subscale scores. That can be pretty onerous. The good news is we've tried to tackle this 2 different ways. First, we have a 24-item version of the scale, 2 items per subscale. That makes it a lot more manageable. We also developed a website called the MindFlex.org that allows therapists to have their clients fill out not only the MPFI, but also a standardized measure of depression, the PHQ-9, standardized measure of anxiety, the GAD-7, and a handful of other measures of well-being. So with just 15 minutes of your client's time, you can get a profile that shows how each client is doing on the 12 dimensions of flexibility and a bunch of dimensions of well-being and psychological distress. So I wanted to show you a case study. This was a female client in her late 20s. She had a history of trauma, was in therapy specifically for depression, and she attended a 4-week, 8-hour ACT group, followed by weekly ACT individual sessions for the following 6 months. If her therapist, Katie, had just used the AAQ2, what she would have seen across that 8-week group, 4-week group, 8-hour group, she would not have seen significant change on inflexibility. She would have seen that depressive symptoms significantly dropped, and would have seen no change on anxiety. And by the way, these are T-scores, so the non-clinical mean is 50. 10 points is a standard deviation, so 64% of people would fall within this typical levels. And then scores in this range are represent impaired. Had she used the compact, which she did for these clients, she would still have would have failed to see significant change on the 3 dimensions of inflexibility and flexibility that the compact assesses. She would still have seen that significant change in depressive symptoms. But with the MindFlex assessment, it actually becomes, we get a far more nuanced picture. We can see that between pre and post, there's very little change on any of the dimensions of psychological flexibility, but we can see clear drop. We see a drop in inflexibility with the 30-item composite, but more specifically, we see a drop in lack of contact with values and a drop in self as context. And this actually corresponds, go ahead, is my next slide. This corresponds nicely with her therapist's experience of this client. When the client first presented to group, she would share her feelings and then immediately apologize for them and shame herself for having had them, really high on self as content. And over the course of the group, was able to let some of that reaction go. She also presented in a bit of a state of crisis and was completely lost and really felt detached from her deeper values. And over the course of the group, was able to reconnect with those values. We actually, since Katie continued treating her in individual therapy after the group, Katie had this client complete another MindFlex assessment at 6 months. And you can see as her therapy continued, she started showing increases in diffusion and contact with values. She started recovering some of her vitality and energy, showed drops in not only self as content, but also fusion and drops in lack of contact with values. And showed drops not just in depression, which continued to improve, but also in insight. So I just wanted to give that as an example of the more nuanced kind of findings you can get if you use a longer scale that measures all 12 dimensions. Okay, so that's the MPFI and the MindFlex assessment that you can use to show that to your clients. Now I want to show you some results looking at mechanisms in ACT. So the first one I'm going to show you is a meta-analysis. This is from a different meta-analysis. But a meta-analysis involves three key components. You pretty much, well, it starts with a comprehensive search of the literature for all articles on a specific topic. A good meta-analysis also includes a structural review where you sort of give an overview of that literature. Whether you found 10 articles, 20, or 100, you talk about the things that they have in common, the areas they might have sort of missed, or the gaps in the literature. You give readers a sense of what's going on in that field. And then the meta-analytic part is you extract this as near as possible to the same effect out of each study and statistically integrate them to come up with an estimate of that effect across multiple studies. So meta-analysis is a study of studies. Because you are suddenly combining a bunch of smaller studies into a much larger meta study, it also gives you power to test what we would call moderation. Do we get this result for all subjects, or is it stronger in one gender than another, or is it stronger in one demographic group or another demographic? Do you get stronger ACT treatment effects if it's given in a group format or in individual treatment? So this was a project that I did with Jenna Macri, who was an undergrad in my lab. She was actually doing an honors project, and she found so many articles for her honors project, for the introduction of her honors project, that we turned it into a second paper that was this meta-analysis. And this is currently under review at the Clinical Psychology Review. So we focused on studies of ACT for treating psychological distress. So that could be depressive symptoms, life stress, anxiety, worry, burnout. And we were interested in looking at how ACT led to changes in various dimensions of flexibility, which then led to changes in pre-post treatment changes in distress. So we searched ProQuest, Web of Science, those databases. We also went to the ACBS website and looked at the over 600 papers posted there to find all of the studies looking at treatment mechanisms in ACT. We found 789 records, screened their titles and abstracts to identify the ones that were likely to have relevant results. That gave us 545 articles to read. And from those, we ended up with 70 records that could be included in our meta-analysis. Some of those, we call them 70 records because some of them are master's theses or dissertations, so they're not all published articles. But across those 70 records, there are 61 distinct studies. So there were some studies that yielded multiple papers with distinct effects that could be explained. Across the 70 records, 20 of them were unpublished. That's important because you always worry if you only review published studies you might be biasing your results to show something strong, because we know we need strong effect sizes for things to get published. So to the degree that there is a publication bias, you only include published articles, you might be inflating your estimates. That represented 7,956 subjects, which were predominantly female and white, and in their 20s and 30s and 40s. Within these 70 articles, 61 studies, 51 drew from at least part of their sample from clinical populations, 28 drew at least part of their sample from non-clinical populations, and 17 drew their samples from students. 15 were single arm treatment studies, meaning everybody in the study did one treatment, and you're just looking at pre-post individual treatment. 56 of the studies were randomized controlled trials. 33 of them used a wait list, and 25 used some alternative treatment. You might wonder, wait, 33 plus 25 doesn't add up to 56. That's because a couple fancy studies had both a wait list and an alternative treatment. And they were given in a variety of formats. Get myself out of the way. 32 were given as group interventions, 11 used individual therapy, 10 online programs, and 8 of them used workbooks. So this is the model that I told you I wanted to test. Does ACT change flexibility? Does ACT change psychological distress? And are changes in flexibility linked to corresponding changes in distress? Now, all of the studies, so there were 37 studies looking at global inflexibility as a potential treatment mechanism, usually using scales like the AAQ2. And we got a nice large Cohen's d, repeated measures Cohen's d, of -0.59. So ACT caused global inflexibility to drop over a half standard deviation as a result of treatment. So we are reducing inflexibility. ACT also led to a significant drop in psychological distress, consistent with hundreds of studies. And changes in inflexibility were linked to corresponding changes in distress. So the change scores of inflexibility correlated about 0.47 with changes in psychological distress. So this is exactly what we were hoping to see. Now, I said this is within person change, single group. All of the studies that ran analyses with global inflex as a mechanism could be included, pretending that that ACT treatment group was the only group in the study. There were some studies, 15 studies that compared ACT with a wait list. So when we did that, then ACT is only getting credit for the changes in global inflexibility that were observed in the ACT condition above and beyond any change that they might have seen in the control condition in the wait list. Does it make sense? So again, we see that ACT leads to drops in distress, ACT leads to drops in global inflexibility, and changes in inflexibility are linked to corresponding changes in distress. But these effects for the unique drops in inflexibility and the unique drops in distress have shrunk just a tiny bit because we are comparing it to that wait list. And when you contrast ACT with an active treatment, I would say about 2/3 of the time that was cognitive behavioral therapy, and about 1/3 of the time, or in about 3 or 4 of the 11 studies that had this, it was compared to treatment and choosing. Again, you see ACT leads to drops in inflexibility, and ACT leads to drops in distress, and drops in inflexibility are correlated with corresponding drops in distress. So this is the evidence of global inflexibility serving as a treatment mechanism. That makes sense. Therapists seeing clients with ACT will engage in metaphors and exercises trying to raise clients' awareness of forms of inflexibility. So we didn't just look at global inflexibility. So I'm going to come back to just this path A. Did ACT lead to changes in flexibility? We found changes, let's see. Can I do it? No, I can't. We found changes in inflexibility, but also in drops in lack of present moment awareness, cognitive fusion, experiential avoidance, selfish content, and inaction. And increases in committed action or contact with values. It's difficult. The scale that they use to assess this most of the time sort of collapses those two aspects of flexibility together. Increases in acceptance, increases in diffusion. And those were all statistically significant. When we shift to just the studies comparing ACT to a wait list, you can see the effects remain significant. They shrink a little, but they remain significant. So across these 70 studies, 70 records, 61 studies, we see that all of these different forms of flexibility and inflexibility are showing the kind of shifts that you would anticipate. And those remain, make myself even littler. Those remain significant. Many of those remain significant, even when you compare ACT to some other active treatment. We also looked across these 70 studies to see if changes in various forms of flexibility were linked to corresponding changes in distress. And once again, with everything except present moment awareness, which really had only been looked at in one study, we found significant correlations in the expected directions. So drops in inflexibility were positively correlated with with corresponding drops in distress. In contrast, increases in committed action were significantly associated with decreases in distress. So we found meta-analytic support for flexibility and inflexibility as mechanisms, treatment mechanisms within ACT. We also found some interesting moderation results, but actually we tested, the most interesting thing about the moderation is how few moderation results came out as significant. It ended up, it didn't matter as much whether it was given in group or individual, although I think the effects for individual were just a little larger. It did matter, you got stronger effects if you were testing this in a clinical population rather than a student population. You also got stronger effects if you screened out severe psychopathology. So if you screened out people with psychotic disorders or with suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. We ended that meta-analysis with a bunch of recommendations. I don't know if you noticed on the previous slides, but generally, the measures of psychological flexibility in ACT process measures, the current ACT process measures, with the exception of the MPFI, generally focus on forms of inflexibility. So a lot of the dimensions of inflexibility had quite a few studies looking at them. There were not nearly as many studies looking at forms of flexibility. So our review emphasized the need for studying both flexibility and inflexibility. the advantages of using multidimensional scales like the compact and the MPFI. The importance of looking at things beyond just distress, like well-being and vitality. Most of these studies were just simple two-wave studies. They take an assessment at baseline, pre-treatment, and then they take an assessment post-treatment. The difficulty with that is you're saying, okay, pre to post, there's a change in flexibility. And then between those two exact same assessment points, there's a change on distress. It's not clear which caused which, right? It could be that the distress went down, which then caused the flexibility to improve, or vice versa. It's probably a bit bidirectional. But if you have multiple waves of assessment, like were you to take weekly or bi-weekly assessments, brief assessments throughout the course of therapy, you could track which change occurred first and which change, I'm sorry, I'm not saying this very well. Which change on which variables tended to precede change on the others. And that will help. So we need more longitudinal data, and for that, it would be helpful to have a lot more intensive assessments. It's also important that we have a wonderful body of literature showing that ACT works, but I think it's a time for the field of acceptance and commitment therapy to start looking at non-specific factors, that how the rapport that clients feel, the client's motivation for therapy, and showing that ACT works above and beyond those non-specific factors. The vast majority of the studies of ACT have been randomized controlled trials, which is great. They have high internal validity. People have controlled and make sure that there's not things contaminating the study or artificially producing treatment effects. But it doesn't tell us how ACT works in the real world as much. And there have been a handful of really great effectiveness studies, but we could use a lot more. We need to know how ACT works in the real world. So that brings me to the last study that I want to talk about. The MindFlex Assessment Project. I need to give a shout out to my collaborator, Brooke Grayhart, who spent 2 years of her life meeting with me and helping set up this project. Surprisingly, took a surprising amount of effort to get it all underway. And then Jenna Macri, whose name you saw earlier, who helped with a bunch of the recruitment. She effectively tripled our sample size. So the MindFlex Assessment Project is clinically validating the MPFI and the MindFlex profiles that it generates. It measures flexibility, but and inflexibility. It also measures depression, anxiety, and a number of forms of well-being. You've seen the profiles that it generates. And if a therapist has a client complete it more than once, then we also calculate which of the shifts and scores are clinically. So this project involved, move my head out of the way. The therapist enrolls, fills out a very brief questionnaire just telling us about their training, and then brings up the study with clients, obtains releases of information in any interested clients, and then fills out a brief questionnaire for each client they'd like to enroll. That just gives us their impression of that client. We then send that client a baseline assessment, and once the client's completed that, we send a profile to that therapist. When the therapist thinks it would be useful to see how things are going, if there's been any meaningful change, they can fill out a follow-up form for that client, which then we will send the client a follow-up assessment. And once they complete it, we'll send that follow-up profile to the therapist. We were able to recruit 43 therapists, all of them from the ACBS website. And that netted us 91 clients who filled out baseline, and then 58 clients who also filled out 2-month follow-ups. We tested for differences between the people who only filled out baseline and those who gave follow-up and didn't find any differences. The 19 therapists, 43 therapists enrolled, only 19 therapists actually signed up clients. So the 19 therapists who signed up clients were all from the ACBS website. They were in their 30s and 40s. They're primarily white and female. I've been practicing an average of 13 years, and they had a range of training, which we thought was awesome. And close to 90% of them had at least 20 hours of training. The 91 clients were also predominantly white and female, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, fairly educated. Close to 60% had bachelor's degree, another 24% had graduate degrees. And they had a range of presenting problems, although anxiety disorders and depressive disorders were the predominant ones. Most of them were in individual treatment, and on average, they had had 2 sessions of therapy at least. So once again, we're looking to see if 8 weeks of acceptance and commitment therapy led to changes in various dimensions of flexibility and inflexibility, if it led to changes in depressive symptoms, and if there was a link between changes in flexibility and changes in depressive symptoms. And I apologize, there are a ton of numbers on the screen. But I've bolded the ones that are a little more important. So we did, in this small sample, these 2 columns right here, these first 2 columns, are analyses just in the people who gave us follow-up, in the 58 people who gave us follow-up. You can see we saw significant increases in acceptance, diffusion, and global flexibility, and significant decreases in experiential avoidance, lack of present moment awareness, fusion, lack of contact with values, and global inflexibility. This second pair of columns are using intent to treat analyses. So for the 37 people, 37 now, 34, 33 people who didn't complete follow-up, we took their baseline scores and filled them in as follow-up scores as well, assuming there was no improvement, no change whatsoever if they dropped out of the study. It's sort of the most conservative thing you can do. Well, I guess the most conservative thing you could do is assume that they got a ton worse, but it's an appropriately conservative thing to do. And you can see this, we saw significant change on the same dimensions of flexibility and inflexibility, even with intent to treat analyses. It's just that change was a little more modest in size, given the fact that so many people were showing literally no change whatsoever. When we looked, and then these last 2 columns are among the 58 people who completed follow-up. Changes in increases in acceptance were correlated with drops in depression. And in fact, increases in all of the dimensions of flexibility were associated with decreases in depression. And that was true even if you used intent to treat analysis. Similarly, drops in all of the dimensions of inflexibility were positively correlated with corresponding drops in depressive symptoms, even if you use intense treatment. So similar to the findings that we got in the meta-analysis, we found that changes in flexibility and inflexibility in this effectiveness study were linked to corresponding changes. So the take-home messages, I've thrown a lot of data at you. The take-home messages from this talk, there are a variety of flexibility of ACT process measures out there. The AAQ2, the OESQ, the COMPACT, the MPFI, and within just the last 4 years, probably another 5 or 6 scales. The good news is they all can help you understand flexibility in your clients. If you want to know very precise information, you might think about the multidimensional scales like the COMPACT or the MPFI. The downside of using those scales, though, is that they do tend to be longer, so that we can assess those. The MPFI was shown to be the most comprehensive, and it consistently assesses all 12 dimensions of flexibility and inflexibility. And the mindflex.org website is a freely available resource that can allow you to track outcomes and flexibility with the MPFI. And finally, I ended the talk by showing you that changes in flexibility and changes in inflexibility were robustly linked to corresponding changes in distress. And I would like to thank my loving husband and my baby puppies who I love with my whole heart and soul.
Thank you, Ron. Does anybody have any questions?
Have you ever looked at ACT for short term? Because I know there's a lot of steps involved in ACT treatment, and I've heard some of the most valuable ones are mindfulness and maybe identifying values. What do you think about kind of that, of how to maybe consolidate ACT as a treatment?
Right. So some of the, let's see. That is a great question. We only looked at, in that last study I showed you, we only looked at 8 weeks of ACT therapy. So that was pretty condensed. There is, in fact, there's a whole book on Amazon, ACT in 7 sessions. And so if I was going to try to consolidate, there are also a bunch of ACT workshops out there. It's like 4 sessions with 2 hours each. And so if you were interested, I could send you the citations for those or point you in the direction of those materials. It's interesting that you brought mindfulness up, because what some of my research has started to do, I put 3 years into making this measure, the MPFI. And then I started, as we were making it, I started noticing that a lot of the contents of the MPFI looked incredibly similar to measures of mindfulness. And it's just in the mindfulness literature, they're given different names, but it's clear they're measuring diffusion. Well, not really diffusion, but well, it's clear that there's a lot of conceptual overlap, and that some subscales of the MPFI map directly onto like the 5-facet mindfulness inventory, the FFMI. So I've done a bunch of studies looking at how sort of making a more integrated model of mindfulness and flexibility. And we even just got a paper published linking all of that to aspects of Buddhism in a cross-cultural sample of people from America, Caucasian Americans, Asian Americans, Japanese, Taiwanese, and Chinese individuals, which is really cool. So, and it's clear that all of those processes are interconnected, and that what we're calling flexibility, like acceptance, diffusion, and self as context, those three things are what mindfulness people call decentralized. And they're really one and the same thing.
I'm sorry, Ron, your voice dropped out then. What those are what the Eastern cultures call what?
What mindfulness researchers call decentering.
Decentering, thank you.
Yeah. And so it's interesting how the two, well, so I've been recently trying to publish a bunch of papers to bridge those two literatures so that they can learn from each other, because it's crazy for all of these mindfulness clinicians and researchers to go off and reinvent the wheel completely separately from the ACT literature when they're all hovering around sort of a similar reality or a similar truth, similar underlying truth. But I'm afraid that didn't really, you were sort of asking, are there dimensions of flexibility that I think are maybe more important to start with? Certainly in our data, now this is well, in our data, in the meta-analysis, sorry, I'm just trying to, I know I'm not sharing screen, but I'm trying to pull that up, so I'm actually saying it accurately. It seemed like fusion and self as content were particularly robustly and were a little more important, and acceptance and defusion. Oh, I'm sorry.
And they were more important in the service of what overall?
Of treating distress, treating psychological distress. I also think, Isabella, that
just
it
treating
kind of
distress.
depends on what your outcome is. If you're trying to help someone deal with burnout, or if you're helping, you may want to, it may be that there will be different dimensions of flexibility or inflexibility that are important for that outcome in comparison to somebody who is really coming to therapy just because they want to have more rewarding social relationships or close relationships. And for that, for those clients, it may be a different constellation of dimensions of flexibility that would be useful. And I think ultimately, I mean, that's why we were excited about the MindFlex Assessment project, because I think if you see, like, were you to get a MindFlex profile for a client and see, wow, they are really high on whatever, on fusion and inaction, then you might want to, I mean, you're still going to respond to the client and try to work with what they bring in each week, but you might keep in the back of your mind, this is a bigger issue for this client. This is maybe something I want to try to touch on if I get an opportunity. Does that help at all?
Yeah, definitely. And that makes sense too, of why the multiple components of the whole model is important, because if you can pinpoint exactly what is needed, that'll help you maybe find a starting point as well within that. So that's really cool. But yeah, thank you.
I mean, a lot of times the clients give you the starting point, right? They sit down in the chair, some crazy story comes out of their mouth, and it's like, okay, well, that's where we're starting today. But these things can help with that and give a little dirt.
Ron, do you happen to know, and I guess maybe not, in the way that ACT, like I imagine in ACT groups, there's a protocol and they go through each of the 6 processes. I've seen some of those kind of protocols, but in individual ACT therapy, it's often respond to the process that's in front. I mean, that's how I practice anyway. I respond to the process that's in front of me.
Right.
And so I wonder if these studies that were examined in the meta-analysis or anything that you found were pointing to, were the therapists practicing, were they responding to what emerged in a more intuitive manner using the ACT processes as their foundation, or were they following specific protocols?
That is a great question, Susan. Fewer of them were individual therapy. And I think, you know, I got trained in, so I'm actually a couples and family researcher who is now becoming increasingly ACT focused. And actually ACT matters in romantic relationships and families, and I have to really pull that out. But I got trained in integrative behavioral couples therapy, and which is really very similar to emotion focused therapy for couples. And that is just like you were talking about with ACT, individual ACT. You take what the couple brings into the session, and you have this toolbox of things, but you grab the one mentally that you think is going to be most relevant and bring that into the therapy session. So it's not a rigid thing. It's a client focused way of applying. And I agree with you. I think that's really a very effective way of doing it. A lot of the ones in the meta-analysis that were group format or online format or workbooks. And those would be less client responsive and more formulaic. So, I mean, we still got beautiful findings. It still looked like the changing flexibility, increasing flexibility and decreasing inflexibility was very helpful. But I think it may be underestimates of just how awesome ACT can be when given in that more responsive form. So that was fantastic. We found, and that was individual versus the other formats did give us some moderation. Like the individual did look a little better. So that's totally consistent. Joanna, you had a question.
Yes. So, one thing that's kind of come up in some of our early conversations about, ROC-ACT and us as a group, is even kind of how to describe who we are. And so even kind of the splitting and the lumping that can happen with, within mindfulness, DBT. But I was wondering if you could, maybe think about this research in terms of like second versus third wave, kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. So, what resonates for me about this whole approach is the shift, right? So it's not necessarily what you're thinking or that we have to change your thoughts, but it's the process. It's how you're doing it. It's how you're approaching. It's how you're observing. So I just wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit about what this means as far as old school CBT.
Yeah. So I have to say I love that shift. That's one of the things that has drawn me to ACT. And it's hard to say, okay, that's a negative thought, I'm just going to replace it or force my mind to go another direction. In fact, that sometimes can cause more fusion when you try to do that, when you try to do a skill like that. So completely independent of my work on the MPFI and within the field of ACT research, I started reading a bunch. I grew up Lutheran and got confirmed there, and then was an Episcopalian in Pasadena because it was a super awesome Episcopal church there. But I think all religions are just facets of an underlying truth. And so I spent a summer reading Buddhist texts, and it just really resonated, the whole idea of slowing down and not immediately jumping into a reaction when some aversive stimulus, something upsetting happened, or some negative thought or challenging or difficult thought or feeling popped into my head. Just being able to open myself to embracing it and allowing it to be there and finding space to choose the way that I want to react to that and what meaning I want that to have in my life. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still get upset and my husband will be the first person to tell you that I am no saint, but that really, really resonates with me. And so that's what I think, that's where the magic in the third wave CBT comes in, bringing in that acceptance and that shift from trying to change something to just being sort of accepting it and not rigidly clinging to it, but allowing it to be, is a huge difference. Did that answer your question?
I could keep going, but I will, if anybody else has something, but I'll just throw this out there because I think it's really interesting in terms of where the whole field of psychotherapy is going in terms of diagnoses and a nosology that focuses on categories versus a functional process-based approach. And I wondered what your thoughts are on that, given that we're exploring this third.
I am so glad you brought that up as well. I actually think that we see, like when we were extracting effects from all of these 70 studies in the meta-analysis, we saw changes on some dimensions of flexibility in treatments that were not ACT, that were treatment as usual or CBT. And I actually think that some of these dimensions of flexibility are, I guess, trans approach, like that they are part of the core of just doing good therapy, regardless of your orientation. And that if you're doing compassionate, if you're creating a nice unconditional positive regard where your clients feel safe and feel accepted, you're modeling some of these aspects of the Hexaflex model without ever naming them. And it makes sense to me that some of these will probably be mechanisms in other therapeutic approaches, even though they're not foci. They're not stated foci of those approaches. So in the same way that I think ACT is transdiagnostic, I think some of the dimensions of flexibility could well emerge as sort of foundational just for any good therapy. Does that answer your question?
In part, we didn't talk about where the DSM is going or where it's not going.
Yeah. Well, I think where the DSM is, so where I talked about the underlying truth that I'm anticipating seeing in my own research. Where the DSM is going is as much a political question and a financial question as it is a scientific question. Because at the end of the day, if we want mental health services for the broadest range of the population, we need to be able to reimburse insurance companies and get reimbursed by Medicare and Medicaid.
Did you say that we need to be able to what?
We need to be able to, insurance companies need to be able to pay us for that, right? And so from the medical model, you have to have a diagnosis to be able to be reimbursed, right?
No.
And so part of the battle that we're fighting is getting them to shift away from that medical model, diagnosis or not, and understand if this, if these components are there, this person is suffering regardless of what label they're on and they need services. And if the insurance companies say, okay, even if we don't have those specific finite labels, we will pay for those services, then I think that the DSMs can go far more transdiagnostic and dimensional, and it will work well. but the insurance companies are going to want to, the insurance companies are worried about their own bottom lines. So diagnoses are the gatekeepers, right? Diagnoses are the way they say, we will not pay for 36 sessions if somebody has no diagnosis whatsoever. So I'm generally an optimistic person, but I hope that the insurance company follows the science, the insurance companies follow the science and allow the DSM to become less categorical and more continuous. That makes perfect sense to me. But I think it's an uphill battle, unfortunately. I don't know. What do other people think?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a hard road to hoe.
Isn't there a global movement though among, people in ACBS and other organizations that are trying to depathologize the work in some ways?
Well, I mean, I've always said, I think everybody can benefit from therapy. Everybody can benefit from introspection and self-reflection and healing whatever wounds they carry around. I think that's, so I am 100% behind depathologizing, but again, you rub against that, will insurance companies reimburse? But I'm 100% for that movement.
I mean, in a different direction, at least, mindfulness is a buzzword. So that, is getting traction in places like schools and, from a wellness and preventative angle, are there ways we can, like I said, incorporate?
Yeah, I totally agree. So I've just published my third article in the journal Mindfulness. They didn't like any of them. It gave me a really hard time going through the peer review process. But from a mindfulness and from a Buddhist perspective, all these 12 dimensions that we are talking about fit right into different forms of mindfulness discussed in Buddhist teachings. And so my most recent paper, I had a Buddhist monk as one of my co-authors so that I could make sure everything was aligned. Actually, because one of the reviewers accused me of misrepresenting the Buddhist teachings and the writings of this one monk. So I invited that monk onto the paper to counter those harsh reviews. So if you present it as mindfulness, it might be more, certainly it's consistent with a lot of what we're saying in ACT, and it might be more palatable. Although, actually, I don't know if you heard a week or two ago, Houghton Mifflin had a math textbook, and it's my cousin is an editor at Houghton Mifflin, and she helped create this. I don't know what math they were teaching. It was some elementary level, but they included some simple emotional regulation skills. Like, this might be tough. If it is really upsetting you, just take a moment, do something relaxing, come back. You'll feel better, and it will be easier. Things like that. Like, nothing radical. And Governor DeSantis of Florida banned that textbook from being used in any elementary schools in Florida because of those emotion regulation skills that they included in the math. And my cousin Rosie was super upset because she was really happy to be able to include that the company was excited about it, thought it would be helpful, especially for kids struggling with math. And now that book is banned in that entire state because of DeSantis. So it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes
I think we have like colliding worlds here. So you've got, politicians who have their reasons for doing things and their choice principles that they're operating on that might include wanting people to be distressed or not, that might be to their advantage, and same with other economic systems and whatnot. So I think, trying to manage all the overlapping worlds that are out there can be troubling. But I do think a mindfulness-based approach can help our clients in particular navigate those collisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally agree. Well, I've gone way over the time. Did you want to do the breakout groups, or do people have more questions? I just didn't want to take over.
I'd like to ask the group here how many people are interested in getting more involved with ROC-ACT and how we might facilitate, getting to know folks and networking. I know from talking with ACBS, they really would encourage people to join as individual members for ACBS, and we are definitely moving towards affiliation. And of course, the more people in this area who feel a resonance with ACT, I think would benefit from this kind of gathering, this kind of networking. So I'm just curious what other people think about doing that.
I mean, I can say I'm interested. I think I'm also interested in these questionnaires. They're new to me. I feel like I'm a new voice here to the group. And I'd just like to know, how could I access them and how could I like play with them a little bit with patients and just kind of learn how to use them? I don't know if they're just like generally available or.
They are generally available. You can, any of the questionnaires,
How about yours?
Your website is in the announcement, Ron, your lab website, because they're on there, right?
Yeah.
Oh, are they? Thank
Yeah,
you.
the announcement, like on Facebook and all that, has his website on there. If you click on it, there's a measures tab, and they're
so
all there.
I'm rarely on Facebook, so I will be shooting in the dark here. So I just got the link.
We can email it out. It's also in the announcement. However you found out about the announcement today, it's on that. So if you got the email from
Mike just Mike sent out the email.
Okay, so if you are on the email list, we can have him send out a sort of summary, something.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
It's been really nice. Thank you very much for putting this together. I appreciate it.
And so relatedly, if anyone is not on the listserv and would like to be on it, Joanna, they're supposed to email Mike, right?
Yes, I just put it in the chat.
Oh, did you? Awesome.
We want to respect people's privacy with their email addresses since we're recording. So if you want to shoot an email to mike@mikemordcounseling.com, and that's in the chat, he'll put you on our listserv. We'd love to have you.
And Jenny, I was trying to private chat you hello because I just saw that you were in the group, but I did to everyone. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I thought we got the hug too.
I sent a message to you too, Jenny. There's people here I haven't seen in a long time, so that's really fun. And yeah, I just want to reinforce that we're just getting started. ROC-ACT, we're just figuring out what we want to do and how we want to support people. We're excited to keep learning more about ACT and applying it in our work and seeing what initiatives we can come up with in the area, and maybe even working on some research projects. Who knows? We could do anything with this group. And with Ron's support, like we could do anything. So if you'd like to make sure that you're in the loop, please do make sure we have your address, and we'll keep it moving. There, like Charlie who said that we already have the consultation group going, but there's opportunities for other consultation groups to start, perhaps with different models. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Portland model. There's a very specific way of doing consultation groups, which are more focused in certain ways. So there's all sorts of, we can form this and make it whatever it is that will best serve us. So we really welcome your input.
And anyone is also welcome to join our consultation group, the one that's going so far as well. Is it the third Friday of the month, 12 to 1:30. We've been doing them on Zoom recently, and Mike has the link for that. But we hope soon to be more in person, and same thing with these meetings and as well. It'd be nice to see people's faces once we can figure out.
I joined this group this evening because the write-up said if you have an interest. I'm really not familiar with ACT, but I've heard about it. And I'm just curious if there's some introductory information as to what it is, how it works, and so forth.
So Mike actually has a few presentations prepared already that he and I have been kind of looking at a little bit to do some education, some kind of brief, an hour intro or 2-hour intro kind of thing. So I think the plan was for us to have a few of those along the way. And we also have a therapist who provide consultation and ACT as well, and supervision. So you can always ask for that too.
Also, I'm wondering about this, a great question. There is so much available already. There's so many free videos and YouTubes, so much in the ACBS website. So it might be the case that you could just poke around the ACBS website, but because it's so, there's a training section you can look. But we also might, if we could also put out, potentially we could put out some links to some introductory YouTubes that we feel are useful, that might be helpful too. So definitely, keep that, ask for that.
Yeah, I'll send you my email and there's a bunch of really great trainings on praxis. Russ Harris has a bunch of good ones as well. And if you need CEs, the praxis ones usually cover
There's free
those.
stuff too.
There's free stuff as well.
Yeah.
I can send you a message.
Thank you.
Certainly, yeah, we have no like qualifications, or barriers for entry. If you're interested, great. I mean, one of our first conversations as a little group was, both what do we have in common, but also ways that we might think we're a little bit different in how we practice. And
yeah,
we don't want to split too much. I think some of us use different words to describe what our approach is, but we actually have a lot in common. And so if you're interested in any part of, the concepts that Ron was talking about, flexibility, aspects of, suffering, experiential avoidance, mindfulness, diffusion, cognitive, like if you're interested, we'd love to have you.
thank you.
One of the other things that we're thinking, I guess we've mentioned this, I'm personally very interested in having a reading group because there's some really great books out there and I get like a third of the way through them and kind of drop off. I would really like to be in a group of somebody holding me accountable and also really to talk about the ideas together and how we apply them in our clinical work. That's my interest. So lots of ideas and opportunities.
I want to thank everybody for being here. And Ron, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And thank you for the research that you're doing. It's really important. And I'm looking forward to reading what you're doing with the Buddhist connections, because I'm very interested in that too. So yeah, I'm just really thrilled that everyone was here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, everyone. This was really fun.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, keep us
Thank you
posted.
so
I think there
much.
might be some interest in if we as clinicians can also, be a part of anything for you. Please keep us posted.
That's a heck yeah.
Did your slide say you were currently enrolling people and therapists in the
Yeah, in the
In
mindfulness assessment.
the last one?
Yeah.
So if we wanted to find out more about that, Ron, how would we do that?
You would just go to mindflex.org. I think that's also, I just typed it into the chat. That's also, Jeanette, do you want me to send you a copy of my slides?
That would be amazing. Yes, please. That'd be great. Yeah.
Well, have a good
Thank you all. Enjoy
Thank
the
you
rest
so